Hello everybody, this is the first of a handful of review videos I'll be creating for you. It will cover what the College Board considers to be Unit 1 material, and I call it review because it's all stuff that we pretty much covered already and most of you have a pretty good handle on. You have a couple options. One is just to turn the sound off and read the slides just to refresh your own memory on things. Or two, listen to what I have to say, because for just about every concept of what you need to be doing while you're watching this is thinking about how each concept applies to each of the countries we've studied. This will be important on this year's test because the argument essay will ask you to apply a concept of the College Board's choosing to two or more countries and construct an argument about it. So just in case I say something helpful, you might want to leave the sound on and maybe even make some notes to yourself that you will be able to refer to during the exam, because this year it is open notes, as you have probably heard. Now, the first 2 or 3 slides, I'm having trouble thinking of how they might work themselves into this year's test. They're just sort of generic concepts used by comparativists when they're talking about how to compare countries. But just in case you see these terms pop up on a test, either this one or some other one in the future, because you're all going off to college, the word quantitative comes from the word quantity and refers to numerical data like charts, tables, and graphs. Qualitative information comes from things that are written out in words or in pictures or in other kinds of visual representations. This year's exam will feature an FRQ specifically called Quantitative Analysis, where you'll be presented with a graph or table of some sort, and you'll have to answer questions about it. So be prepared for that. It's been a while since we talked about what's normative and what's empirical. I doubt these would pop up on this year's test, but let's refresh our memory. Normative, think of normal. Normal is a matter of opinion. So normative means based on subjective viewpoints, subjective values. Empirical means scientific, based on objective observation, objective measurement, testing experience. It's quantitative, factual. I'll give you a couple examples. America's the best country in the world. That is a normative statement. You can disagree with it. It's hard to prove. The United States has one of the highest standards of living in the world. That's an empirical statement, so you have to say it in a British accent to sound smart. Again, this year's test, the number of topics has been narrowed down, so I'd have a hard time seeing them working causation versus correlation into the test. But maybe while you're writing, if you have to prove that something has led to something else or something else causes something else, just make sure you're using precise language and using words of causation like because or thereby. Causation means something happens, and as a result of that, something else happens. That's causation. Correlation just means two things happen at the same time. They don't have to actually be connected to each other or have anything to do with each other. They're just coincidentally happening at the same time. And I gave you a couple examples here. You might remember back in class we talked about the pirates and global warming. That's the kind of silly stuff you get into when you take correlation too seriously. Now, because one of your questions is guaranteed to be a quantitative analysis question, I absolutely see the possibility of you having to understand one or more of these many statistics that we studied back in the fall. HDI is one of them. If you don't remember that it'll probably be explained to you, but if you don't remember that HDI stands for Human Development Index, usually when I see H in an abbreviation of some sort, I think of health, to be honest. So, but that's okay. So, because here one of the components of HDI is health statistics from a country. Think of other things that make quality of life better, having an education, having a decent standard of living. So those things are all part of HDI, and you do not have to memorize certain statistics. Just know what they mean, and like I said, you will see a question that's based on statistics, and you just have to understand what they mean. You don't have to remember any particular ones describing the countries we study. These are 2 pretty easy statistics to keep in mind. Gross domestic product, total production inside a country in a year. If you call something per capita, you mean you're dividing it by a country's population. A capita is a person, or a cap is a person. The United States has the highest GDP in the world, but one of the countries we study is number 2. And it's rapidly catching up to us, and will probably surpass us sometime soon. But the total GDP and per capita GDP tell you importantly two different things. Gross domestic product by itself is total, per capita is per person. Because China's population is 3 or 4 times ours, it'll have a hard time ever catching up to us in terms of per capita GDP. Overall GDP, like I said, it's going to go away soon. Our lead will go away soon, but per capita, we've probably got a comfortable lead in that department for some time to come. Just in case you get a variation on GDP statistics, sometimes you might see mention of something called growth rate. Growth means increasing. Rate means how quickly. If GDP goes up 10% a year, that's actually quite a rapid, for most countries, that's quite a rapid growth rate to have. For a while, China pretty much achieved that on a regular basis, but the law of diminishing returns, if you've ever taken an econ class, it's hard to keep up that kind of pace. As your GDP grows, it's hard to keep growing it at the pace that you were growing it when it was smaller. So you might see a question about growth rate, and just make sure you're thinking properly. Any growth rate that is positive means your country's economy is growing. If your growth rate is positive but going down, your economy is still growing. It's just not growing as fast. For an economy to shrink, for the GDP to actually go down from one year to another, you'd have to have a growth rate that is negative or below 0. Just make sure you understand that, and you'll be ready for any question that involves GDP growth rate. Gini coefficient, or the Gini index, is an attempt to measure income inequality. You might remember from back in the fall, in case you have trouble remembering this, Gini kind of sounds like the first couple syllables of inequality. So that's how I remember it. Gini index is a measure of inequality, income inequality in a country. And probably any question you get would explain how the statistic works a little bit, but it might be helpful to remember just overall what it refers to. As we discussed back in the fall, there's an organization called Freedom House that attempts to measure the degree of freedom experienced by people of various countries around the world. They have come up with ways to actually measure things like the civil liberties and rule of law and pluralism and participation. You do not have to remember the statistics on this slide, but you might just want to notice that, no shock. When talking about freedom, which country ranks the lowest of the 6 that we cover? China, of course. Which one ranks highest? The UK, and the others are kind of scattered around in between. Tracks very closely or correlates very closely to democratization of a country versus authoritarian characteristics. We also talked about this back in the fall. There's an organization called Transparency International that generates a corruption perception index. They survey key individuals in each country and survey them on their perception of corruption inside their own country and compile the scores. And no surprise again, the UK, kind of similar to the United States in that respect. We've tried to put in place various procedures and rules and laws to prevent corruption in our society, and they've been mostly successful, at least compared to a lot of countries around the world. China's somewhere in the middle. I kind of got to wonder, at least of the 6 countries we study, I got to wonder about that one. But anyway, as you would expect, Mexico, Russia, Iran, Nigeria, all ranking very poorly on the corruption perception index. You don't have to remember those specific numbers, but just in case you have to, it helps your argument on the argument essay at some point. For the most part, this tracks very closely again to the degree of democratization. Although China and Mexico, kind of interesting where they're placed on this list. Another statistic you might see appearing on an AP exam is called the Fragile States Index. It used to be called the Failed States Index. It's recently changed its name to Fragile. It basically tries to rank and measure countries according to just how resilient they are, how they might resist, how well they might resist shocks to the system and avoid or fall into what we might call societal collapse. Unfortunately for Nigeria, out of the 6 countries we study, it is the most fragile of the 6, not in the world, but of the 6 we study. And as you would expect, they're scattered around in pretty much the same pattern we've seen on the other statistics. The UK is the most stable, and Mexico kind of in the same neighborhood, sort of, and the other ones pretty far behind. It's been a while, so here's a reminder that a couple important concepts that could pop up on the test. The difference between a state and a nation. A state is a group of people occupying a certain territory with a government that has sovereignty. And there's the College Board's official definitions there, if you want to pause and make note of that again. Informally, the term state is often used to refer to the country's national government or just the country itself. We use it as if it means country, and sometimes we incorrectly use it as an equivalent of nation, but as you know, a nation is simply a group of people with something important that's culturally in common with each other. It is quite possible, and there's lots of examples around the world of people who consider themselves to be a nation, but do not have a state. Just ask Palestinians, Kurds, Tibetans, you name it. It's also possible to have a state that is composed of many nations, and that comes up from time to time in some of the countries we study. Let's see, the UK is composed of the English, the Welsh, the Northern Irish, the Scots, that definitely have their own sense of identity. Russia is composed of dozens and dozens, well over 100 different ethnic and religious and religious groups. Nigeria is probably the worst case scenario, kind of artificially created country that has dozens and dozens of people who have trouble seeing themselves as Nigerian and think of themselves first as by their tribal identity. It comes up in almost every country we study, Mexico, Iran, China. So it's a great concept to have in mind, and you should be thinking hard about, how would you bring different countries in if the question revolves around state versus nation. Another pair of terms that it's important to keep straight are government and regime. A government is a specific set of institutions and individuals who are in charge of a country at any certain time. A regime is more of a type of country, a type of government, and usually we categorize regimes as democratic or authoritarian. It is possible to change governments without changing a regime. And that happens all the time when, one president gets elected and replaces the previously elected president. Now, let's see, looking at our countries that we study, huge examples of regime change would be when Soviet Union, the governing Communist Party lost power and they transitioned to some sort of kind of democracy in the early 1990s. Regime change in 1979 when the Shah of Iran was overthrown and replaced by the current theocracy, the theocratic regime of Iran. Let's see. Regime change happened in China in 1949. They went from a group of people calling themselves the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, in charge of something that was kind of sort of democratic, and was replaced by a communist government with Mao Zedong at the head, and that's the government that's the regime that's been in charge ever since 1949. Those are some of the examples and then in Nigeria. Lots of examples of regime change because when they got their independence in 1960, there were various attempts over the next 40 years or so to institute something, a constitutionally based democracy of some type, and they didn't ever really last very long because they were overthrown and replaced by some sort of military dictator. Those are examples of regime change. For the last 20 years, they've had a kind of a stable constitution in place since 1999. And they have had a series of peaceful elections and peaceful transfers of power, and those are changes of government, not regime. Hopefully they've turned the corner, and will carry on for a very long time their current democratic experiment. A highly likely topic to come up on any AP exam for comparative government is the interplay between democratic elements and authoritarian elements. Just about every country has elements of both. It's just a kind of a question of which ones predominate. There's the list right there. You should make note if anything isn't already kind of familiar to you. The categorizations of the 6 countries we study, the UK definitely in the democratic category, Mexico definitely in the democratic category, although go back far enough into the 20th century and that might not have been true. Nigeria definitely in the democratic category these days, but go back more than 20 years and it would have been authoritarian of some sort. China, authoritarian. Russia, somewhere in the middle, pretty authoritarian with elements of democracy, and there's all this hope in a lot of people's minds that they kind of go back to something more democratic once Putin's out of the picture. Iran, definitely authoritarian, and I think that covers it. The word democratization, as the form of the word implies, is a process. It's a transition from authoritarian to a democratic regime. You wouldn't get any countries any questions asking you to discuss the democratization of the UK because that's been going on for 800 years. But democratization is a term that is absolutely a term that you can discuss when talking about Nigeria today, Mexico, because both of those countries in fairly recent history have become measurably more democratic. Russia is going in the opposite direction, but a question about democratization could include Russia. China, Iran, not a whole lot of democratization going on there. The list of things to look for as a country becomes more democratic and less authoritarian is there on the slide, and you can pause it and make any notes you need. And here we go. Still on the topic of democratization, something like political corruption is something that helps get in the way of democratic process. An independent judiciary, the role it can play in reducing corruption and holding the not necessarily elected, but the other branches accountable for their actions, protecting the individual rights of the people. Those ideas can come into play in any question about a democratization. It's also important to notice that democratization is not necessarily always a story of progress. There can be interruptions, there can be reversals. Democratization can happen and then unhappen for a variety of reasons, and the slide discusses a couple of them. Consolidation has the idea of becoming more solid, becoming more mature. Changes that take place in terms of election rules and separation of powers, things like that, like we've seen in Mexico over the last 30 or 40 years. That's a great example. The changes in Mexico since the 1980s and 90s. That's a great example of democratic consolidation. A similar story going on in Nigeria. Good things to have in mind, depending on what questions you face on the exam. The terms power, authority, and legitimacy are all similar, but they do have distinct definitions. Power is the ability to get other people to do what you want, plain and simple. Authority is the right to use power, and legitimacy is the belief among people that the government has authority, that it has the right to rule over them. People tend to be lazy and use them as if they're all the same word. Technically, there are differences. So be careful if you see a question about these things, because they do have distinct definitions. However, as the next few slides will show you, when you start talking about the sources of power, or what sustains or subtracts from legitimacy, you're going to get the same kind of list, because these terms do cover a lot of the same ground. And so when talking about what contributes or detracts from them, you're kind of going to get the same concepts over and over again. So let's take a look at the next few slides. So what are the sources of power and authority? What kinds of things exist or don't exist, or go on or don't happen in a country that might contribute or not to the power and authority or legitimacy of a country's government? Some countries, having a constitution is really important. Almost every country on earth now bothers, good for us Americans, showing how to do things. Almost every country on earth bothers to write a constitution. So in some sense, a constitution is the source of authority for almost any government on earth. More in some countries than in others. In Mexico, the Constitution is really important. In Nigeria, they are really, really trying to make that Constitution, of 1999 stick, and they've been doing a good job for the last 20 years or so. It's interesting that even authoritarian governments like Iran and China, they bother to write a constitution, and they claim to play by the rules. Now, China, it's a little ridiculous because they kind of change the constitution kind of whenever they feel like it. For example, Xi Jinping recently abolished term limits on his own office. So how important is the constitution really in China? But they bother to write one, and they bother to change it when they feel like it. So obviously it means something to them. Now, in Russia, you can call what goes on in Russia pretty much Putin's ballgame, but even he bothers he respects the Constitution, at least to the extent that if he wants to not live by it, he bothers to change it first. As we saw from after he served 2 terms as president in the early 2000s, he dutifully followed the Constitution and stepped down from power. And in the 4 years he was not the president, he made sure that the Constitution got changed so that he could be president again. And now he's doing the same thing. He wouldn't be doing that if the Constitution weren't important. Religion is an important factor, more in some countries than in others. It's important, obviously, in Iran. It's a theocracy. But it does play a role in the legitimacy or the authority of countries like Russia. It even comes into play a little bit in the UK. The military is a huge source of power especially when you're talking about authoritarian regimes. The military props up the regime in Iran. The military props up the regime in China. Everybody knows if you mess with the political system anyway, you're going to meet military force. So it's a huge part of their power and authority. Political culture, we talked about this, especially when it came to Russia. Statism. The average Russian person is just more psychologically likely to favor a very strong government, whereas in a country like the United States, where we're all about the rights of the individual, that kind of attitude is foreign to us. Anyway, your political culture of a certain people will be an important source of power and authority in some cases. Whether or not you have a lot of popular support, whether you hold legitimate elections or not. Putin goes to a lot of trouble to make sure that he wins his elections by a lot. Even though everybody knows it's all kind of rigged, he can point to, I won by 80% or something like that. And that helps his his authority within his own country. Nationalism. Putin is a ardent nationalist. Xi Jinping, ardent nationalist. They talk about their nation and their role in the world and us versus them all the time. It's a huge part of their power and authority. Tradition. The country with the longest tradition among the 6 that we study is the UK. An awful lot of what they do and how they do it goes back hundreds of years. Parliament's been around. Magna Carta's been around for 800 years. The monarchy has been gradually losing power over the last couple hundred years. Effectiveness. Now, this is important for every country because every country has specific goals, mostly revolving around making sure the economy grows and the people are safe. That's a kind of a challenge right now in the days of coronavirus, but and the global economy tanking the way it is. But look at China. I mean, Mao took power back in 1940s, and he was all about being communist and promoting equality. Well, once he was out of the picture, the current leadership, the current paradigm, the current mindset of the Chinese leadership is we have to make sure we deliver stuff to our people. Economic growth is almost job number 1 for the current Chinese regime. Beliefs, ideology, belief systems, founding myths, revolutions. I just mentioned China and how they've kind of gone to being make sure we have jobs and income and prosperity for as many people as possible. Well, but they still pay lip service. They still think that the founding ideology is important, and Mao Zedong and the struggle he went through to found the country. Iran keeps alive the hatred of the United States every chance they get. And that's an important part of their power and authority, just being anti-America. Charismatic leadership, the best example, again, is Putin. Goes to a lot of trouble to create a cult of personality around himself. So depending on what you want to throw into an essay, there's lots of material to work with from the various countries we've studied. When it comes to sustaining or maintaining legitimacy, there's a lot of overlap between the slide we just looked at and this one. Making sure that a government stays legitimate in the eyes of its people. A lot has to do, and this is pretty much every country, is what it's doing effective. Is it effectively managing the economy? Is it effectively managing the healthcare system? Does it solve various natural disasters or other crises in a quick and effective way? Tradition, charismatic leadership. You can look at this slide over yourself. It's a pretty standard rendition of what not only helps a country's government, have power and authority and legitimacy, but to keep it as well. A similar concept is political stability. How does a government stay in power and avoid challenges to its power and avoid disruptions in its orderly maintenance of society? Different countries have different challenges, and this list could actually be much longer, but here's just some ideas. In every country, corruption is a bad word. So every country takes steps to combat corruption. It's more public in some countries than others. China and Mexico are definitely constantly campaigning against corruption. Every president of Mexico, when they run for president, that's high on their list. They're going to stop all this corruption. And good luck with that. The second bullet applies to Mexico too, stopping violence and drug trafficking. Every country has some sort of inequity within its system, and they're all about reducing discrimination or the lack of status of some group compared to another group. Every country democratic or authoritarian, has to deal with mass movements and protests whenever certain problems arise. Every country has issues and problems, and they're always talking about reforms and discussing changes and how effective they are, and so on. It's an issue in every country. So if you get a question about political stability, be creative. And it's not a kind of question where it only happens in democratic or authoritarian regimes. Every government on earth has to worry about its stability and take steps to preserve it. Changes in power or authority usually come in one of three versions. Especially in democratic regimes, it's almost always the result of an election. That's one thing we like about our system, is that it's peaceful transfers of power, peaceful change in government. This most applies to the UK, Mexico. Yeah. Coups. It comes up in this course basically as a leftover from when this kind of went on in Nigerian history. There has not been a coup d'etat in any of the 6 countries for a very long time, so I'm not sure this is really kind of an active concept on the test, but it's in there. Just know that they're relatively quick. They might be violent or non-violent, but they don't generally result in regime change, just in government change. A revolution. None of our countries have experienced a revolution recently either. However, they are central to the existence of some of our countries. The Chinese Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, even the Mexican Revolution back in the early 1900s. So these words are fair game on an AP comparative government test. And another pair of concepts that you guys have been studying for, almost 3 years now. Federal versus unitary systems. Unitary, uni, means there's one government, one national government. All the power is constitutionally given to one national government. Federal means power is divided. There are levels of government, national and subnational levels. I'll give you a second to pause if you want, and it should be a pretty quick process to come up with the unitary governments and the federal governments that exist among the 6 that we study. The unitary systems are the UK, China, and Iran. The federal systems we study are Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. And in a unitary system, there can be subnational levels of government, but the important thing to remember is that they exist because the national government allows them to exist. They are not constitutionally protected. Their powers are not constitutionally guaranteed. They can be withdrawn at any time, as is the case in the UK. That's it. Happy studying. See you in the next video.